Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. And today what we're going to talk about is the different type of business entities and go over the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of the various types. We're going to focus on three types. There are more, but the three most common types, we're going to focus on a corporation, we're going to focus on a limited liability company, and then also sole proprietorship, and run through those. Before we get started and dive into the detail, just a few housekeeping items. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to add them to the chat box or the question and answer box. We'll be happy to get to any questions during the presentation. As well, after the presentation, we will send you the this chart that we're going through, this new business entity chart that summarizes a lot of the pros and cons and the differences between the different types of entities. We will also send you a copy of this recording, so you will this presentation or webinar is being recorded, and it will be put on YouTube after. And then finally, we do have a number of other videos on YouTube, some business videos and also some immigration videos. One reason that a lot of people like this new business entity webinar has to do with the fact that for many different types of immigration visas, like E2, sometimes E1, L1, there is a requirement to set up a business entity. So often clients have questions about the type of business entity that they should select. And I am pretty well suited to speak about this because in addition to being a lawyer, I am a CPA and had an investment banking career before my lawyer life. So with that, let us jump into it. And we see the, in terms of, as I mentioned, the three different types of entities. And really the first question, that we run through is, who is this particular type of entity good for? Who does it work very well for? And now, before we kind of jump into it, I do want to kind of just talk a little bit about a corporation and an LLC in particular. So when, corporations have been around for a very, very long time, and everyone's familiar with what, or most people are familiar with what a corporation is. A corporation, a separate legal entity, they issue shares. But then another very important thing with a corporation is that it offers what's called limited liability protection. So if an individual starts a business and they invest, let's say, $100,000 into that business, and they put the $100,000 into a corporation, and then that's the maximum amount that that individual can lose, right? So as opposed to an individual, for example, that starts a sole proprietorship, and even though they may say, well, I would like to only invest $100,000, and they put it in a business bank account, and they say they have a sole proprietorship and not a corporation, and but then they do stand to lose more, because what can happen is, if an individual, something happens with the business, let's just say something simple, someone comes to the business and they slip and fall and hurt themselves, and they sue you. The United States is a very litigious environment, and let's say that they sue you, then if you're in a corporation, the maximum they can sue you for are the assets that are in that particular corporation. But if you have a sole proprietorship, then they can actually sue you for your personal assets, so your home, car, investments, savings, et cetera. So that's, just as to start off, that's one of the reasons that we do like to and almost always recommend to clients that they set up a limited liability entity. Now, we started talking about this, corporation being the limited liability entity, but an LLC is also a limited liability entity. So what that means is, for both a corporation and an LLC, you are in a situation where the maximum amount that you could lose is, related to the assets that are in the business. Now, just some background on how LLCs, got started. Corporations were around forever, but then people found them complicated. People found them, you have to adhere to what we call these corporate formalities. You have to appoint a board, you have to have meetings, you have to take minutes, and people found that really confusing. And then, alas, the LLC was invented, and what the LLC was invented for was to make it kind of a simplified version. So to give people still the limited liability protection, but give it to them in a manner that was somewhat more simplified so that they didn't have to adhere to some of these corporate formalities. So a lot of clients like the LLC just because of the simplicity. It does have some compliance requirements, but a lot of people like it with respect to the because of the simplicity. So when we're kind of going looking at the three, and we'll start on the my the right hand side where we say sole proprietorship. It's a sole business owner who wants little limited compliance, like doesn't really want to have board meetings, doesn't want to, even an LLC has an operating agreement, doesn't want to have to be bothered with any of that, but they have the risk of being sued for their personal assets. So that's why we almost never recommend a sole proprietorship, because you never know. You could be posting something and then you inadvertently use a photo or a picture of somebody's, and then you get a demand letter in the mail from the owner of that. And then if your business doesn't have a lot of money, let's say you're starting a small business where this is just like a $10,000 thing, what they're suing you for could be a lot more, and they will be able to come after you and take personal assets as well. So not worth the risk, I think. Both corporations and LLCs can have multiple owners. An LLC could be a sole owner as well, and a corporation could be a sole owner as well. But often they have they have more owners, and then the difference between those two, we're going to go into this in more detail, but a lot of the time people elect for an LLC because of the simplicity, and we're going to talk more about that because it's not just the corporate formalities that we look at when we look at the simplicity. And then also, arguably, a corporation has a few more tax planning advantages. So then we look at the number of owners, and we said corporation can be one or more. LLC, same thing, one or more. And sole proprietorship, if it's more, that means that it's individual sole proprietorships, individuals having their own separate sole proprietorships, because there is no formal entity really that exists. So one thing, when we look, you see in the chart where we have corporations, we say 1 to 100 if it's an S corporation. Let's talk about S corporations a little bit, because they are important. Now, one of the reasons that people shy away from a corporation, or sometimes an LLC format, depending on what election you make for the LLC, is that they are afraid of what's called double taxation. Now, with a sole proprietorship, it's quite simple. The taxation is quite simple. Any money the entity makes is as if the individual made it themselves. So it's going to go on to their personal tax returns. But with a corporation, it's different, because with a corporation, there is a completely separate legal entity that is set up and exists for the purposes of business and revenue. And so that separate legal entity, you have to make a separate corporate tax return and then pay taxes on that particular that separate corporate tax return. So in some cases, you could set up an entity, pay taxes on that tax return, distribute money to yourself, and then have to pay taxes again. So that's what double taxation is. But what the government allows is two things. For an LLC and corporation, first, the default for an LLC is what's called a pass-through entity. So you're treated in the same way that you would be treated as if it was a sole proprietorship. So the money is going to just go on your personal tax return. So there's no separate corporate tax rate that's applied. So that's LLC. But the corporation, for small corporations, like we see between 1 and 100 owners, there is an option to elect for something called S status. S is in Sam status, and what that allows you to do is to be treated as a pass-through entity for the purposes of your entity, so you do avoid double taxation. Now, there are some restrictions here, like, so for example, the corporation can't have more than 100 owners, and all of the owners have to be residents for tax purposes. But other than that, it's a good entity, so that someone can avoid avoid the double taxation issue. And we are going to talk a little bit more about S corporations and some of the restrictions with respect to that. in just a second. So now we look at the types of owners, and here's where we get into some of the restrictions, right? So for an LLC and a sole proprietorship, it can be anybody. You can be a foreign national, you can be, you can have a visa, you cannot have a visa. There's no requirement in the United States that you have to have a visa or a passport to own a business. So an LLC and a sole proprietorship, no problem. And same thing for corporation. Anyone can own a corporation. However, if you are electing for S status, then it is limited to residents for tax purposes. Now, often there's a common misconception here that this means citizens and green card holders, but it absolutely does not. You can be a resident for tax purposes just by spending 183 days in the country. So you can have, you can have S, you can elect for S status in many different situations. Including maybe perhaps a situation where you don't even have a visa, because if you are in the country for more than 183 days, you're going to default into the U.S. Tax resident rules. But I think the key thing to take away from here is, because I see a lot of articles and a lot of people who think that that you have to be a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, and that actually is not accurate at all. In terms of advantages and disadvantages, we talked about the disadvantages of the sole proprietorship, the fact that you can be sued, but the advantage is it's inexpensive. You can set it up quickly. It's, I think, most jurisdictions between $50 and $70. You don't have many administrative things to do. You don't have to file a separate tax return, so that's often a reason that people select it. An LLC, on the advantage side, you can have less administrative burden, less than a corporation. Often with an LLC, you just need an operating agreement. So if it's a small company, the operating agreement can be quite simple. If it's just an individual that's owning the LLC, then you could use really any operating agreement. You can have an unlimited number of owners, and then you don't have the restriction as well related to pass-through entities that a corporation would have for electing S status. So that's often a reason people elect for an LLC, because it's simpler, easier, less restrictions. But the problem with an LLC is that people aren't that familiar with it. So an LLC doesn't have shares, for example, it has membership units. And right away, if you're trying to raise capital and you're saying to someone, well, I'm selling you membership units, they might be, well, what's that? Is that the same as a share? Does it sound like a share? It might be not as valuable as a share. So definitely when you're looking at that, often when you are raising capital through private equity funds, they'll make you, if you have an LLC, they'll make you convert to a corporation before, because everyone knows what a share is and they know what different classes of shares are. And you can basically get it to the same place with an LLC. But I think marketing is a big thing when people are buying things. And if you are raising capital, then often people do want to see a common share or preferred share and things like that. And then also there might be advantages in terms of different tax saving through income splitting and things like that might be possible for individuals through a corporation. So when I was deciding between a corporation and an LLC, I ended up picking a corporation because I knew the business was going to expand, and I thought that there would be more tax saving opportunities. When we go to the disadvantages, again, most of these we've spoken about, but the corporation. Sometimes you may want more than 100 owners. And then if you do have even one person that's not a resident for tax purposes, then you can't elect S status. And it could be quite significant impact, because if you're in New York, for example, if you're not electing S status, then you're going to have federal taxes, which are around 21%. And then you're going to have state and city taxes that are going to bring your tax rate up to almost 40% before any distributions are made to you. So it can be quite significant if you can't elect for S status, and having one non-resident for tax purposes can make it so that you're unable to do that. The other issue with LLC sometimes is that some jurisdictions, not many, but some, have what's called a publication requirement. So New York, for example, has this publication requirement where you have to spend around $1,000 or more, or sometimes a little less, but depending on where you are in New York. But basically advertising that you have set up this new entity. And I have no idea why this is still on the books in some jurisdiction, but it is really just something that's inconvenient and really quite a little bit of a money grab, especially today, because it is a paper subscription that you're doing. Sometimes it can be online as well, but just really not worth it. The sole proprietorship, the cost of formation is low, and LLC incorporation, it can be moderate. LLC can be expensive with the publication requirement, but without that, it can be moderate. It's usually $200 to $300 to set up an entity. Sometimes it can be much more expensive if you want the entity set up very, very quickly. Almost all jurisdictions allow for expedited processing, so like let's say 24 hours or even sometimes 2 hours. And then if you want to do that, that can be more expensive. But generally speaking, setting up an entity is not that expensive. The other kind of thing with setting up an entity is, when you contrast it to setting up an entity in a place like Europe, it is very easy. In Europe, we set up an entity in Europe, and it's very, very complicated, time-consuming, and you need a notary, and the notaries aren't like here. You have to pay them hundreds of dollars, around $700-800 to notarize. Then it takes a long time to set up an entity, months sometimes to set up an entity. Extremely bureaucratic process. Whereas here, often you can set up an entity online, so it's much easier to set up. And all of these entities, often you can set them up in the same place. But definitely the sole proprietorship is going to be the easiest to set up, and the others are not. In all honesty, setting up an entity is not difficult. I think that the thing you always want to do with setting up an entity is coordinate with tax and business professionals so that you're setting up the right entity, but also getting tax advice, because tax advice is worth its weight in gold with respect to making sure that you are doing kind of the right thing, making sure that you're doing the right thing. I know we've mentioned, kind of being sued, but I think it's, it's something that people often take for granted and maybe don't pay enough attention to. But with corporations and LLCs, there is a concept called, piercing the corporate veil, but which means that an individual could still go after someone if they had a corporation, but it's very rare. And if you follow the corporate formalities, if you you have your board meetings, document, etc., if you do that, you're not going to be at risk of piercing the corporate veil. So it is, although it is a bit of a pain to set up these entities, it really, really is worth it. And especially in the United States, if you're coming from a country where it's not that common to sue, that is not the case in the United States. So it's just definitely better to limit your liability. And a lot of the time when people are investing in real estate, they will use LLCs to hold each piece of real estate that they're investing in, and they do that for tax and liability reasons. And so we talked about this as well, about double taxation, and to reiterate again, sole proprietorship, you're never going to be subject to double taxation because there is no separate entity. For an LLC, it's possible that you're subject to double taxation, but we still have a no listed in the chart, and that's because the default is that it's a pass-through entity. But there's kind of more complicated tax structures that you can elect for in an LLC, and again, that's why it's often important to do this in conjunction with your tax advisors so that you are making the right selection. And then can I make an S election? Sole proprietorship, we have a yes there, but it's really because you don't have to do anything to make the S election. So, and then for an LLC, we have a yes there as well, but really what we're getting at there is it's a default pass-through entity, but you can also have your entity treated as a corporation. So there are kind of tax reasons that sometimes we do that, or why people elect for that. And then in those instances, you do have to actually make the formal election. And then, do I pay income taxes? The two things you can be certain of are paying taxes and I guess death. Those are two things you can be certain of. And so certainly all of these entities, you have to pay taxes. The corporation, though, is definitely going to be the most complicated because it is a separate corporate tax return. I'm a CPA and I would have trouble putting together a separate corporate tax return. So the other two, the LLC and the sole proprietorship, you're going to be able to use your personal tax return to complete that. So it's going to be, it's going to be a lot easier. And then, in terms of paying self-employment taxes, because often we're kind of entrepreneurs setting these up. So in essence, kind of, yes, they're going to kind of be through different means. Like when you come to the United States, you have a number of different taxes that you pay. You have federal tax, you have state tax, but then you also have, payroll taxes, right? So you have payroll taxes that are going to be based on the pension, based on Medicare, so Medicare or Medicaid, I always mix them up. But these payroll taxes are going to be there. And then the other thing to kind of keep in mind is, and there are going to be tax planning opportunities with respect to this, because depending on, taxes can be very complicated, because depending on where you are located, like if you're in New York City, for example, then you have to worry about 3 jurisdictions: New York City, New York State, and the federal government. And so then, how it is that you structure, like whether you pay yourself through salary, whether you pay yourself through distributions, all of those things are going to be things that that you really have to look at in order to make the assessment with respect to like how best to compensate yourself such that you are maximizing tax benefit. And then the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that when you are doing your salary, if you have an S corporation, you are required to pay yourself a reasonable salary. So you can't kind of get out of these payroll taxes by just saying that everything is distribution. You are required to pay yourself a reasonable salary. And then the other thing to keep in mind is when you're setting up an entity, is that if you are a professional, you do have to set up a special legal entity. So if you're a sole proprietorship, no problem. But if you're an LLC or a corporation, and you're, for example, a lawyer, accountant, things like that, then you have to set up what's called a professional corporation. And the reason that they have this is because they don't want people, because what ends up happening is you can end up there's malpractice insurance that us lawyers, for example, when you have a law firm, you have malpractice insurance, but malpractice insurance is not mandatory. So sometimes like a lawyer can say, well, I'm not going to get malpractice insurance, but then, they can only sue me, limited to what's in my corporation. But the professional bodies don't like that. So because they want to encourage people to get malpractice insurance. So they say that, well, if someone sues you for malpractice, your limited liability doesn't cover that. So that's why, all lawyers or other professionals would get malpractice. And there are other kind of reasons that these professional bodies or groups want to regulate or manage their profession. They want to make sure that the people that are setting up these entities can't just use the entity as a basis to avoid professional responsibility. So definitely when I set up the corporation, for example, I had to set up a professional corporation, and there's definitely more to do with setting up the professional corporation than if you are just setting up a regular corporation. But yeah, so that is really a summary of the different types of business entities that exist, and really kind of touching on, like, I am a CPA but not a tax advisor, so really just kind of touching on some of the tax aspects. But I think that the key thing is, in particular, as your structure or business gets more complex, that you have the appropriate people advising you, so that and in particular tax, I have tax counsel in Canada, I have tax counsel in the United States, and we have tax counsel in Spain, because we have offices in all 3 places. And it is very important to make sure that you are understanding the tax law in all of these jurisdictions, and where it is that you can if you're setting up something in the States, where it is that you can use tax optimal structures that comply with the law. But again, and I see someone wrote happy holidays to everyone as well. And but I don't see any other questions. I know there's some of the subject matter here is a little bit on the complicated side, so it takes a little bit of time to digest. Oop, I do see something. I do see something here, so let me answer those. A little to digest, but let me see. I just had a couple questions here. Do you need to be physically present in the U.S. in order to open a business bank account? Great question. So, so you don't have to be. However, most banks will require that you are. So if you like, sometimes we've had clients that have prior relationships with the bank, and as a result of that, the bank is comfortable opening up the account for them. But generally, because of money laundering and security issues, the bank wants to see someone in person to open a bank account. We just had a short reel on this, opening up a US bank account, that we posted on our various platforms like TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube Shorts. And it's basically, how do you set up a business bank account in the US? And it goes over that exact question, that often a bank will want to see you in order to open, but not necessarily. Next question is, do we need to have a US residence in order to open a business bank account? No, absolutely not. So to open up a business bank account, what you need is tax ID for your business, so an EIN number, and you need a the articles of incorporation for your business. So those are the two legal documents that you require in order to open up a business bank account, but it doesn't require that you own a residence in the United States. Almost all of our E2 clients, like we do a lot of clients that come to the United States to start businesses in the United States, and they many of them are not living here before they get the visa. But all of them have been able to open a bank account when they've been able to come to the US. We have had the odd person that's been able to open a bank account from, not coming to the US. But again, it's one of those situations where they have some relationship with the bank before. Do you need to have a US registered phone number? Could it be a mobile number? No. I mean, there's no requirement to have that. So what I would advise everyone though, is that whenever you're going to open up a bank account, or whenever you're dealing with a bank, banks in the United States are notoriously bad, right? We just closed our banking relationship with one bank. I couldn't wait to never have to deal with them again, and they're just notoriously bad. So what you always want to do is, if you're opening up a business bank account, make sure that you're calling the bank and speaking with the manager to find out what exactly it is that they're going to require for you to open the business bank account. Because sometimes you'll go there, the person that you speak to doesn't know what they're talking about, and people are very good at saying no. So another question, I'm planning to buy 50% of an already existing company. Do I need to still register a business entity? If yes, what kind of entity do you recommend? Well, if you're buying 50% of an existing company, I think that the question of whether or not you open up a new entity, well, it depends what you're buying. So you could either be buying 50% of the shares of the existing company or membership units of the existing company, or the two of you could be going in and starting a new entity. If you're buying, we all, when someone's buying 100% of a company, we almost always recommend that they just buy the assets of the company and not the actual legal entity, because then you don't have to worry about whether there are tax liens against the entity and all these different things. But if you're buying 50% of the entity, really it depends on what the person's selling, right? So if they're selling the shares, then you'd really have no choice but to buy the shares of the entity. So I think the answer really depends. Do you need a personal bank account as a prerequisite in order to open a business bank account? No, you don't require that. It's not required. It's often, if you had a personal bank account with that particular bank already, then that would be a good reason why opening up a business bank account would not be a problem, because they already have a prior relationship with you. But it's not required that you have a personal bank account with them. So we've had I think that the bank that we just closed all of our business accounts, we only had business accounts with them. We didn't have any personal accounts with them, but we were going to expand and add personal accounts. But after the first few months of service with them, it was so poor that we decided not to do it. And I won't mention the name of the bank, but it was. But the problem is that many banks are the same. It's not like there are a ton of they're just unfortunately often they're focused on their very large clients, and then so the smaller businesses or individuals get very kind of poor service, I think. So it's unfortunate, but there are some good ones out there. We have just an absolutely amazing bank now. This one I don't mind mentioning, City National Bank, which is a great bank that we just great customer service, great. You can actually call someone up and get someone on the telephone to assist you and things like that. Whereas, unfortunately, our experience with banks prior to that, you know, it just wasn't good. And we do like, in terms of our firm, we do set up business entities, both for clients that are looking to start get visas from in E2, but then also we do a lot of entity setups and various levels of complexity, a lot of entity setups for other clients as well. When they're basic entity setups, we can set them up, you know, in different places. But when if it is kind of much more complicated, where it's like kind of regional issues are coming up, like if you have to do a shareholder agreement that's specific to Florida or whatever, then you know you need local counsel for that. So but yeah, so, you know, setting up a general business entity is a task any CPA can do, and you know, anywhere in the States. So. Excellent. Sounds good. So, Grant, thank you very much for joining us. And you, as I said, you'll get all of that material sent to you, perhaps in the new year. It might be today, but perhaps in the new year. And Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you. Bye bye.